Margaret of Cortona, a woman who, again, lived just 2 generations after Francis died, 2 or 3 generations after he died. A woman who was very well known among contemporaries. In fact, she was so famous, she was considered the third light of the order. That would be the third light of you, the founder of the Third Order Regulars. And again, how many people know Margaret of Cortona? If you're deep in the Franciscan tradition, you've probably heard her name, but can you tell her story? So I'd like to tell you a little bit about her story and once again invite you to learn her story so that you can retell it. Margaret was a woman who had fallen in love with a man. She was probably middle class, maybe even upper middle class, but he was from the nobility. Marriage at that time was all about politics and economics. They never got married. Nevertheless, they lived together for probably about 10 years in what seems to be a happy relationship. They had a child, they had a dog, and I can imagine lots of blissful stories that we could create around what their life looked like. Husband, child, dog, I can imagine happy times over the dinner table, teaching your child how to use a spoon, telling your child not to give the dog scraps from the table. I can imagine going out to the yard, playing games, taking long walks with your child and the dog. Happy times. There seems to have been no problem with the fact that they weren't married. People accepted them for being upstanding citizens, living their lives. And then suddenly tragedy struck. One day the dog came home, leading Margaret to find her man dead in the gutter. He'd been attacked maybe by robbers, perhaps for political purposes. We don't know. That part of the story isn't quite clear. But you can imagine the trauma of a woman seeing her beloved dead in a ditch. So breathe through that part of the story. Allow that to be part of the beginnings of her conversion, because she was shocked out of what was a very happy life. She was shocked out of that life because the death of her man disenfranchised her completely. They weren't married. She had no legal rights to inherit any of his property. She was disenfranchised from her family of origin. They wouldn't take her back. She had nothing, nowhere to go. I use Margaret's story to highlight the aspect of conversion that you have on your website. Conversion. And yet, like all of the stories, she exemplifies so many of these characteristics, including poverty. She had fallen into utmost poverty. She lost her family life. She lost her happiness. For reasons we don't know, she moved to the hill town of Cortona. Central Italy is full of these hills with magical towns on top of them. And she walked through the gate of Cortona. We don't know why. We don't know what she expected to find there. But she ended living the rest of her life there. First, she and her son were taken in by 2 noble women. Women whose names are not known. And so that's a feature of this story. How many women of faith go nameless through history? And yet what they did was save her life. They saved Margaret's life and they saved the life of her son. They took them in, fed them, gave them lodging. And you know what happens over dinner tables. Conversation happens. Conversion happens. That's what happened. Margaret went through a series of conversions. that started easy enough over dinner. She wanted to become a tertiary Franciscan, that is, a member of the Third Order. She was very much taken by the models of the Third Order Franciscans that she saw. She admired their way of life. She wanted that for herself. And at first, the Franciscans didn't believe her. She was too pretty. She was too young. She was too attractive. That gives us pause, I think. Pause and forces us to reflect on how do we judge each other by how we look. Here, Margaret is presumed to be insufficient, not qualified for the lay Franciscan life because she was so attractive. Whose fault is that? Just have to put that out there. Eventually she prevailed. Eventually she was able to become a tertiary Franciscan, and she wore a singular garment so she stood out in her community. You could tell by looking at her that she was a tertiary Franciscan. From some of the images we have of her, it was kind of a plaid. Now, if you've ever been to Italy, Italy is not known for plaid, and so she wore this plaid outfit. So she definitely stood out in Italy. She did what many people on the religious path have done in the Christian tradition, and that is she sent her son off to a monastery. We don't know if they ever saw each other again, but she renounced her her role as rearing her child in order to follow the religious life. These passages are often very quick in the texts, but I'd like us to reflect on that. Does anyone think it's easy to do that? Does anyone think it's easy to say goodbye to your child so that you can follow your religious vocation? So I'd like us to pause on that moment in Margaret's life and reflect on the kinds of decisions that lay people often do make for their vocation that affects their domestic life, that affects their relationships. It's actually pretty common. Perhaps not that specific example, but to make these extreme changes in one's life for one's vocation. Margaret became an important spiritual leader, and I would say religious leader, in Cortona. She was involved in pastoral ministry, again in close affiliation with the Franciscan friars. She became known as a woman that other women were comfortable around. Perhaps in terms of spiritual direction, yes, but also women brought their babies to her to be baptized. She was the baptizer of women's babies. They felt comfortable bringing their children to her. She took this sacramental role up. The lay people recognized her leadership, and they turned to her, admired her for it, appreciated her. And over time, she came into conflict with the Franciscans. They were concerned about the kind of attention she was getting from the lay people. They were concerned about her authority. The details aren't always clear, but in some of the chapter minutes, they took minutes of their meetings, it's clear that her physical attraction kept coming up. They were worried that she might bring scandal to the friars because she was so attractive. And they had a close affiliation with her. And after a while, after being told repeatedly not to do this kind of pastoral ministry, this ministry that she was called to, this ministry that she was received happily in and esteemed by, after being told to leave this over and over again, she finally said, I've had it with you, friars. I'm not going to deal with you anymore. I'm going to go out on my own. I'm going to have a hermitage that the bishop is going to support me in. So she moved away from the Franciscan church, and in the final years of her life, she lived in a small cell attached to a diocesan church supported by the bishop. So there's this rift with the Franciscans. This rift that sometimes becomes uncomfortable to talk about. And yet, let's be honest, how often do lay people have conflict with clergy, including the Franciscans? Quite often, actually. It happens all the time. And here we have a model of how this woman of God, handled that conflict. She navigated the ongoing discussions for a long, long while. And finally, in this ongoing conversion, I think this was a final conversion on her part, she said, you know, enough. I'm leaving. My faith is no longer tied to the Franciscans. I'm going up to this cell. This cell that happened to be positioned high up on the hill, so in fact everyone in Cortona could at least see it. So she could still be in their minds. And perhaps she offered some kind of spiritual direction from that cell, but from all the texts that we have, she led a solitary life and was in a hermitage. I use this story of Margaret of Cortona to highlight, first of all, the reality of conflict. Conflict happens. And it has happened even with our holy leaders of the tradition. How do we not navigate conflict? I think in the text about Margaret of Cortona, one could read it superficially, kind of like just also the episode of her leaving her son. We could read that superficially. We could read the death of her common-law husband superficially. But if we read emotion into these episodes, we know that her departure from the Franciscans was grounded in an ongoing conversion, ongoing discernment. It wasn't just an angry, I'm out of here. No, she was living into her call. And so what is it like to continue to live into your call, to live into your vocation at each stage of your life? Conversion doesn't happen just once. No, it keeps happening. That is, if we have a faith life that is alive. Conversion's going to happen ongoing until the day we pass from this life. So I think that's what the story of Margaret of Cortona brings up for me. And I'm interested in what it brings up for you. So as you explore the life of Margaret of Cortona, how would you tell her story? What are the aspects that resonate deeply for you? And how would you flesh out some of these episodes in her life? Okay, I'd like to conclude our time together with just a couple remarks. The stories that I've shared with you, of all 5 women, Jacoba, Rose, Angela, Margaret, and Sancha, I think these stories are foundational for your tradition as third-order regular women, your tradition, your history, and in fact your identity today. Sometimes people ask me, what's the relevance of history? It kind of goes back to those family photographs I was showing you at the beginning. Talking about our family photographs and our tradition helps us be grounded. Helps us be grounded in our identity, helps us know where we come from, and helps us know that we aren't alone. So what you are doing is your congregation, as a congregation, isn't new. It goes back to the very beginnings of the Franciscan tradition. You have a rich tradition that has very deep roots. So I encourage you to know these stories, tell these stories, practice telling these stories in lots of different ways. Yes, like I have, just telling you the story verbally like this, perhaps even reading the stories like I did at the very beginning of our retreat. But storytelling that's compelling and that really reaches into our heart on a deep level are often stories that are told through prayer. To what extent do these women enter into your prayers? The prayers that you say individually, the prayers that you say as local communities, and the prayers that you say as an entire congregation and with people that you're in ministry with. To what extent do these women that we've talked about enter into the art and the music that surrounds you? Again, in your liturgies, to what extent does the music you use engage with these images and with these names and with these personas of these lay Franciscan women? And take a look around you. Look in the houses that you live in. Look at your mother house. How many of these women are depicted? How many images of these women are there for you to reflect on, to gaze on, to pray with? And for those of you who are artists in the community, can you create more? Create more for all of us to appreciate and to learn from and to pray with. You know, art is not just paintings or pictures. It does include music, but it also includes dance. So for those of you who dance, especially liturgical dance, are there dances that can bring life to these figures in your tradition? And another form of art that I would encourage you to explore with these women is web design. To what extent do these women play a prominent role on your web page so that you can be using that web page as a teaching tool, but also as a way to show the world how deeply rooted you are in that tertiary tradition of the Franciscan order. I think you are the important keepers of this tradition. It's up to you to tell these stories. So I know that this book, Women of the Streets, will be distributed to anyone who wants to have access to it. I encourage you to read through the stories and reflect on those aspects that need amplification. Those pauses that I've made in my telling of the stories, whether it's when Margaret left her child, or that pause when Angela told about her prayer, or that pause when Rose came home the first time and told her parents, "I want to preach." Reflect on those pauses and what does that feel like? What does that look like to you? Amplify, fill in those pauses. Tell the story. I'd like to refine and remember this tradition as a legitimate and purposeful part of the Franciscan tradition. We have the friars, Francis, we have Clare and the poor ladies, and we have the Third Order, rich with stories needing to be retold. So thank you for this time together. I do invite you to send me emails. Let me know what you think. Let me know what questions, what comments you have. And thank you for this time. Peace and all good to you.